I mean, every week I'm like, I have some epiphany where I'm like, oh, wait, I think the answer is just sit down and just keep writing and don't get up from your desk until it's done. But like, even if that works one week, it doesn't work for next week.
You're listening to the Taste Podcast. I'm Editor-in-Chief Matt Rodbard, here with Senior Editor Anna Hezel.
Today on the show, we have Pete Wells, the longtime restaurant critic at the New York Times. Also on the show, I'll be talking to Charlene Johnson-Hadley, the executive chef at Brownsville Community Culinary Center, which is a really cool organization in Brooklyn. But Matt, tell me about the mysterious Pete Wells.
It's funny. I actually had seen him a few times in restaurants over the past several years. Didn't tell him that, though. But his face looked kind of familiar. But Pete Wells, God, I love that guy. He's like one of my favorite critics for sure. And we talked a lot about the restaurant reviewing method. How does he pick the restaurants to review each week? How does he edit it? It's really fascinating.
Yeah, and just how to keep it interesting week after week when you have the same assignment.
It's true. And like we did, speaking of week to week, we talk about the deadline that looms every single week. Does it get easier for Pete Wells to file that copy every single week to his editor? The answer is, what do you think?
No.
No, it actually gets worse. It's a really fascinating conversation. I also asked him straight up, like, what should the next New York City mayor do to help restaurant owners survive in what is becoming a pretty apocalyptic real estate scenario? His answer is really interesting.
Here's Matt talking to Pete.
Hey, Pete Wells, thanks for joining the Taste Podcast.
Thank you.
It's nice to finally meet you. We were emailing in like 2015 one time about a meal, and it never happened.
I know that happens with me a lot. My scheduling gets so complicated that even though I go out all the time, I have a hard time fitting people in while I'm still thinking about them, and then the wheel goes around and the wheel goes around again, and then I'm thinking about 8 other things. You know.
Because you need to go out for in the 20s meals a week just to keep up with your schedule. So scheduling must be so difficult. Do you have
I'm terrible at it. I mean, it's a much bigger part of the job than people even would like to think about. I don't even want to make people think about how major it is, but if you really want to know about it, I mean, it's not just like keeping like the guests straight and who's showing up on which night and who can eat which kind of food and like, who has a gluten intolerance and who won't go to Queens. But it's also like, who am I on Tuesday night? So like I have to keep really careful track of like which name I'm using at which time, which phone number goes with that name, and which email address now, because now you almost always need an email address to make a reservation. So which email address goes with which name? Which ones have I used too often? Especially like, has this restaurant seen this person,
that email
before, right? Or have they seen that credit card before, which is, there's not too much I can do about that because I don't have a million credit cards. But so there's a whole bunch of like just keeping track of who I was the last time.
And then you got to worry about actually having an experience that's fair to you as the journalist and fair to the restaurant you're reviewing too, on top of all that scheduling.
Right.
And going in and having a clear head, right?
Right. I mean, I try to just come in and give them the best chance I can, like sort of approach it in not just an open mind, but with like a sort of an eager mind, approach it with some hope that it will be good. Because I think if you walk in and you're sort of, it's another restaurant, I don't know what they're trying to pull, but we'll find out, no, that's not how people go out to eat.
I wanted to ask you about that exact point, because when you go into a restaurant, you do have optimism, and I can sense that from your writing. You're a fan of restaurants more than anything. I get that vibe. But I wanted to know, how does the process actually work? Like, because you have to set yourself up to do something. Like, how do you pick the restaurants really? Like, is it coming from your editor? Are you pitching? Is it a collaboration?
I pick everything. I think it should be that way. I mean, I'm lucky to work at the Times where there's a strong sense that the critics in all the departments should really have their say. But I think that the choice of what to review that's an opinion in itself, right? I mean that you've already cast a vote when you've decided to write about a place or not to write about it. You're casting votes all the time in sort of what kind of place do you gets into your sights and what kind of place doesn't. Do you never look at cheap restaurants? That's an opinion. Do you never look at very expensive restaurants? That's an opinion too.
You also have to be pretty cognizant of the openings and what's happening in New York as a whole, right? Like, there's like certainly trends you have to follow. Often you do a recap of many restaurants of a certain type.
Right.
So you stay on top of that. Is that your own research, or are you working with your editors in the desk to get that kind of thought together?
I wish I had somebody doing some scouting for me. I mean, that was a thing that I think, like Jonathan Gold had over the years, was
his little birds.
He had right. He had people sniffing around, and I would love to have somebody like that. I mean, I have a few people who just do it out of the goodness of their hearts. They tell me about things going on, and Flushing's a good one to keep tabs on. Yeah. But in general, I'm sort of on my own, and there are different kinds of restaurant hunting. So there's one kind of restaurant hunting where I read the column in the Times where we talk about openings and chef changes. And I do that, and then there's another kind where you kind of follow the, Eater and Grub Street news, and that's all kind of, we could call them mostly mainstream places. And then there's another kind that's much more like burrowing down into the woodwork, reading the sort of, some Instagram accounts and some blogs of people who just go to maybe only places in their neighborhood or only places in one part of the city or only places in a certain price range, and that's a much more like scattershot impressionistic view, but like that stuff can be really interesting too.
I've reviewed restaurants myself, and I've also edited longer than I've been reviewing, but I hear you. What you're saying is you're an editor at heart. I mean, you're using, and I think I wanted to talk about your editing career because I think some of our listeners don't realize that you were an editor before you were the restaurant critic of the New York Times. You edited the section, the dining section at the New York Times, and you also edited at Esquire and Food and Wine.
Details.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Oh man, I made that mistake.
That's okay. I'm okay with it. I mean, Details is gone now, so they can't get mad.
They were gone, and also Details at the time you were there was like fucking dope.
It was a good time. It was a good time to be there. We published like weird stuff.
Yeah, you did. But tell me, do you miss editing?
I do a little bit. But I have to say that my goal all along from like the day I moved to New York was to be paid to be a writer, and this is the first time in my life I've been paid to be a writer. So I'm not really eager to move beyond it. I'm like very, very happy to take my check from the New York Times for writing. It's great, But there are things about editing I miss, and I sometimes just like that way, like when you're. It's like sort of sitting at the edge of a poker game, watching people play, and you just want to be like, no. Like I have that impulse all the time watching, not just the Times, but any publication. I'm like, oh, no, this story over here is a kind of interesting one. Oh, what are you doing? Why did you fall for that one? That's not a good story.
Yes, I totally agree. You play armchair editor then.
Yeah. So that impulse does not go away. Yeah. But I'm very happy to be responsible for nothing but my own column every week. When you're an editor, you're like, everybody's problems are your problems. And when you're a writer, it's just your problems. Yeah. And you can make them your editor's problems.
You can.
Which is a wonderful opportunity.
It is beautiful to switch between worlds. I love doing that. But also when you're a writer of a column, you have that deadline.
Yeah.
That's looming. How do you negotiate that deadline? Do you have any?
I really don't do very well. I keep thinking I'm on the verge of figuring it out, but I haven't. I really haven't. I mean, every week I'm like, I have some epiphany where I'm like, oh wait, I think the answer is just sit down and just keep writing and don't get up from your desk until it's done. But even if that works one week, it doesn't work the next week.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, one of the unwritten rules of restaurant criticism is that critics don't tend to punch down. Bad reviews mostly go to the industry giants. But where do you draw the line? It's got to be a tricky line to negotiate.
I don't know if that was always an unwritten rule. I mean, I think if you go back to some of
Claiborne.
Yeah, well, he didn't tend to be that nasty. But if you go to some of Mimi Sheraton's stuff from the 70s and 80s, I mean, she would take down the place serving minestrone and spaghetti, and she would just tackle them. I think maybe it's become more important because the readership is different now. If you were just writing for I think in her days she was writing for readers of the newspaper who lived in New York City and wanted a place to go on Friday night, and now all of us have this international audience. So if you realize that the person in Moscow is reading this, it makes you think twice about really laying into somebody who the person in Moscow has never even heard of. So I try to use, I don't use the person in Moscow as my as my editor, but I try to use the idea of how much do I have to explain to people why I'm reviewing this restaurant before I start explaining how bad it is, and if it's a lot, if there's no good reason to be reviewing it, then you just shouldn't be doing it,
And oftentimes I get a sense just from speaking with critics is you will do those first or even second meals and not write a review. Does that?
Yeah, there's a lot of that.
Talk about that because that's unknown.
There's a lot. I mean, it's unknown. It's probably, I don't know if it should be known or not, but there. I don't have somebody just handing me a sheet of paper every week that says you're going to review, Bong Bar. I mean, in the average week, I go to at least one meal that I end up not doing anything with. Sometimes it's an older place that I'm just checking in on, but more often it's a new place that I had hopes for, and it's either Gail Green has this great phrase where she says it's not good enough or bad enough to write about.
Yeah,
right.
And that's, as a diner, we experience that as well. We go to restaurants that aren't good or bad, and we just don't know what to think about them. We typically don't return, though, to those restaurants. Yeah,
you don't return, and if you don't think too hard about it, you can have a decent night if you're with people you like. And so, I've had a lot of nights that have been saved by a decent bottle of wine.
Let's talk about some specific stories. You wrote a truly epic rundown of the Korean restaurants in Queens that you smartly called the Kimchi Belt. I just want to know, why are more New Yorkers not heading out for these restaurants? I feel they're still underrepresented.
They're still under. I mean, I actually don't know who goes there, but I know that those restaurants out there are not talked about in the way that I think they should be. The quality, I think, is definitely higher than what you get in the Manhattan Korean restaurant district. But people talk about that all the time just because it's central and everyone's been there. I mean, even before I started that piece, I didn't know how far out the Korean restaurant district extended. I mean, it goes beyond the borders of the city out into Nassau County, and you can just keep going.
Oh my God, you can take the Long Island Railroad out to Murray Hill.
Right.
What's another community then that you maybe want to focus on for future columns, or maybe just in general you just are interested in learning more about?
There's a lot of stuff that I'm curious about, and I don't really know if it would rise to the level of a story, but there's a whole bunch of Jamaican places out in beyond Ozone Park that I'm kind of interested in, and there's there's this sort of the area of the Guyanese restaurants that's I don't even know what neighborhood that's called.
Still in Brooklyn?
Yeah. Or actually, I think it's in Queens. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to at least get my head around it, because I think sometimes with these neighborhoods, like, you can't really just go to one restaurant. You have to go to a few.
Three's a trend, they say, right?
Right. So you go to a few, and you start to get a sense of like, well, which is the one? Like, the reason I ended up doing that Korean piece that we're talking about is that I went out to kind of find like one that would be a fun surprise review. And I kept trying to pick like the one, like, what's the one restaurant going to be? And then I got to this point which you get to with Korean restaurants. You're like, well, this one's really good for beef barbecue, but this one's good for pork barbecue, and this one over here does the certain kind of noodle really well. There isn't really one restaurant. There's just a whole bunch that you would go to for one dish, and then like a year later, I finally wrote the piece.
Yeah.
And I think, like, it's, you sort of have to approach these restaurant neighborhoods the same way. Like there's 5 Haitian restaurants within a couple of blocks. Like, chances are they're each doing something pretty well, and maybe there's one that's better than the others.
Like it would have to be extraordinary, though, for the times that commit to a full. I feel like when you make these choices, like the kimchi belt story, it has to be an extraordinary trend.
Yeah, well, that was just, I was like, oh God, there's so much out here. Like, there's just, there's so, and the quality of even like the little porridge place is like so good,
I wanted to ask you, how do you write an exciting review for a boring restaurant? And when was the last time you had to do that?
Well, the place I did last week, Benno, I think some people would call a boring restaurant. And I think, there are ways you could describe it and make it sound boring. And part of the what I was trying to say in that review was like, there's nothing trendy here, and it's almost like a Rip Van Winkle restaurant where Jonathan Meadows like slept through the last 15 years of restaurant history, but he just knows what he's doing. I mean, the food was really delicious, but that, and then I don't know what is exciting anyway. Is novelty exciting? Like, that's one of the things that gets people out to restaurants. Like, oh, I've never tasted this before. Or, this combination of ingredients is completely new to me, or this is a new neighborhood where I've never eaten before. But then it's only novel once, It's only like things are only new the first time, and I think we have this crazy accelerated cycle in the food world, at least in New York, where like everybody wants to go to the new place, and then 3 months later it's done,
and then 9 months later it's closed.
It's done, and then it's closed, or the chef has moved on.
And I think it makes your job extraordinarily complicated and difficult, because you have to negotiate the feedback loop, being very quick, and also know that this is the paper of record, and your reviews matter. It's 40 a year, and I mean, that must drive you a little crazy, though, because you want to make sure you're relevant, because being relevant is key to a critic, but also being reviewing the Bennos of the world, the classically trained, and the people who have spent the time in the industry in this restaurant world. You pay respects to the heritage, but you can't always just do the geezers, right?
Right.
You can't always do the geezers.
Right. You can
Respect to Benno. He's not a geezer, but that was just a general.
Yeah, no, he's not.
He's not. He's a cool.
He's got a little ways to go.
Yeah, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you try not to jump on things that are just trend driven, or I mean, I don't tend to be that interested in the club restaurants that are sort of like, ridiculously expensive, and DJs and bottle. Actually, I don't even know what they do. I could. I mean, that may be completely inaccurate, but there are a certain kind of restaurant that's like, the food is like the fifth most important thing going on, and I tend not to go to those. And then there are places that are scenes, but I think that's much less common than it was like in the 70s and 80s, where a place would just become a scene for nothing to do with the food. Like Elaine's was the most famous example of that, where everybody said the food was aggressively bad, but it was a scene, and I think it's harder to pull that off now. I think people will not tolerate bad food.
Hey, I want to ask you, are you traveling still for your reviews? I know that you did that for a while, and it was cool to see you out of New York, but also, I mean, that must have been really hard.
It was a little difficult. but fun. And I just have, I think without even realizing it, ended up taking a little break the last few months. But it's probably time for me to get back on the road again.
What are cities that excite you, just in general, being very broad?
Well, I mean, there's certain cities where you can just land and know that you're going to find something, even if the place that you thought was going to be your number one pick turns out to be disappointing. You spend a couple days there and you'll come out with a story, and that's always been the case in, like, when I've gone to Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago. I've gone in with a list, and sometimes the one that everyone's talking about is just, it's not right. You're kind of like, well, why are we all talking about this restaurant? But you eat it, eat a few more meals, which when I'm on the road, it means like, maybe a couple of dinners and as many lunches as I can fit in, and then drop in somewhere else for appetizers. And then you try to zero in on the place that actually is interesting.
Yeah. It's got to be challenging because, parachute journalism is something that a lot of people have criticized, but you also want to take your palate on the road. Like, you have a lot of experience, and it's cool to get your take on some of these restaurants.
I think with this kind of, at least the kind of writing that I do, and most of the people I know who are on a national level are writing about restaurants, they're journalists. They're doing a lot of work. They do a ton of work before they even get on the plane, and they've called 1 million people and read 1 million reviews, and I mean, God, we even go through Yelp, give us some credit here. We're putting in the time.
Yeah.
And then we show up, and there can be a lot of bad meals. We're throwing stuff out, that we're throwing out meals that don't really hit the mark. I don't know. Is there a better way? I don't know what it is.
I think you've articulated it clearly. There's good journalism, bad journalism. There's a lot of prep work. There are bad journalists who will just literally show up and go wherever the gram sends them, and it's not really journalism.
Yeah.
I wanted to get back in New York. What should our next mayor do to improve the life for restaurant workers here in the city?
Well. I don't know. I mean, I'm not really a policy person, although I certainly have opinions about things I'd like to see. I don't know how to implement them necessarily. I would really like to see
fair hedge. I'll
restaurants. Take that. I'd like to see. I think a lot of us would like to see restaurants become more professional, less abusive environments. We'd like to see. I think maybe just in the past year, like, sexual harassment has gone from being routine to at least being questioned, and we'd like to see it go to become non-existent, right? We'd like to just see it go away. Can the mayor help with that? I mean, honestly, I think, for one thing, like, just some education would be really useful. Even though we all complain about having to go to these, HR seminars about sexual harassment, and everybody says they're useless. So they're not totally useless, because they did give you the message that, there is a policy and it's not cool to do. And
I think somebody on Twitter proposed this. I thought it was really interesting. If a restaurant owner, the person with the name on the liquor license, is convicted of a sexual crime, they risk losing their liquor license, which everyone knows kills a restaurant.
Yeah, right. I mean, the problem is you're pushing it backwards on, like, what's going to be the fact finding body that's going to decide who's committed a crime. But, like, I don't, I
mean, the courts. You'd hope the courts would.
Right. But then we all know that these things don't end up in court very often for a lot of good reasons. I have a 14-year-old who's very seriously allergic to nuts, peanuts, and so on, and so for all those years we've been taking him out to restaurants and talking to them about his allergies, and just in that relatively short time, restaurants have gotten so much better about it. They actually, like, in the beginning, they would say, like, I don't think we use any of those things. He should be fine. And of course you're like, well, he should be fine is not quite what we're looking for.
Not quite the mark
here,
for
right? And now, like, wherever you go, like serious restaurants or like a coffee shop on the corner, they'll write it down. They'll go talk to the chef. They'll come back and talk to you. And I think that has a lot to do with some education programs that have gone on where the cities and the health department have like really seriously like talked to people. They all have that poster now that you've seen even at your local pizza place that doesn't have any nuts. And I don't know, maybe it's just time to treat, physical and verbal abuse in restaurants like a public health issue.
I wanted to talk about, de Blasio has floated this idea about a vacancy tax. So after a year of a vacancy, the landlord is then charged a tax, and that money goes back to economic redevelopment. I mean, that's a huge problem with restaurants, is being kicked out of their spaces and losing their leases because of these drastic rent increases. But then, of course, the space sits empty for years. So, I mean, is this something that you feel is viable?
I mean, again, I'm very wary of policy things because there's always like the consequence you didn't foresee. But yeah, I think that is worth looking at. I think there are like, commercial rent control maybe is worth looking at. Other ways of like, keeping businesses in places as businesses are really part of the culture of the city, and not just the restaurant, but the handmade toy store that's been there for 40 years, and all these places that we just see disappearing.
We've seen our neighborhoods in Brooklyn. We both live in Brooklyn, and our neighborhoods. I'm near Smith Street in Carroll Gardens, and I think you're nearby. Like, what's happened to our neighborhood? It's
Smith is a great example of kind of runaway greed, where it got hot. The restaurants the landlords raised the rent. It got hotter. They raised the rent some more. It got hotter, and they raised the rent, I think, way too high now because the restaurants are all gone. Like, you walk up and down that strip and you think about what was there 10 years ago, and there are only a handful of survivors.
Yeah, I mean, Batter's Beach is closed,
right?
Which is one of the few. I mean, there are people sticking it out, but you're seeing this in many neighborhoods, West Village as well.
Right.
How do we keep our city whole? I mean, it's really sad seeing all these great people lose their businesses and move out of New York. Talking about food people, of course. We're so passionate about it. We love these people, and it's sad. It's fucking sad.
I know, right? And then I think in the old days, what New York had going for it was that it was the place where you could become famous, and now, chefs and food people can become well known in all sorts of cities, and Esquire will send its restaurant reviewer to Pittsburgh, and there are plenty of paths now to national recognition if that's what motivates you.
Mm-hmm. Do you regret any reviews? You've been doing this for a while. There's been a lot of reviews. We all have regrets. I regret publishing stories and writing opinions. I regret tweets and Instagrams. I might regret some reviews I wrote when I was writing reviews. How about yourself?
I think from the early year, the first year maybe, maybe it went on longer, first year and a half. I think maybe if I looked back at those now, that some of them would strike me as like the negative parts were more negative than the positive parts were positive, and so places that I may have been kind of on the fence about because I didn't really know how to control the spin on the negative things. They just seemed awful. You would just get to them and never want to go there. At least that's my fear.
Are there any names that are floating in your head?
There aren't really.
Yeah.
There aren't really any. The other thing is, I think there are some places that I did just because they were getting so much hype. There were places that were just like everybody was going there, and they had sort of successfully like position themselves as like the restaurant of the moment. And I felt, well, if one must weigh in on this because the whole world cares. And then 6 months later, like we've said, nobody even remembers these places. And there are a few of those that I wish, and I could name them, but I'm not going to because it would just feed into the machine. But there are a few of those where I wish I had just sat it out and looked for something that had some genuine interest instead of manufactured interest.
Hype machine. I want to ask you. You're a true Timesy, and you've been at the publication for a long time. I want to know who are some of your favorite Times writers that you regularly read. Obviously, Food Desk or non-Food Desk.
Oh gosh, well, let's see. There's so many. I mean, I think I read all of the opinion writers. I've lately, I've always liked Gail Collins, and lately I've sort of gone back to her almost because she doesn't scream. You know, I was thinking about this when I was reading the Russell Baker obituary this morning. He had that sort of gentle, mocking sense of humor that's sort of vanished from our conversation. Now, there's no conversation. People just yell at each other. And so I appreciate, of course, all of my, I love Dwight. I mean, I love Dwight.
Everyone loves Dwight.
Yeah. Right.
Anybody writes about with criticism is like, that guy is pretty special.
Right. He's great. I mean, he makes me feel like I'm in the right place. Like sometimes I'm wondering, like, does anybody even care about criticism? And Dwight makes me feel like, okay, maybe the Times does care about criticism. Maybe there's a reason we're all here, you know?
Love that. I think many would say the same about you. I think you make people feel with your reviews that that this moment is important. It gives gravity to food in a cool way. So I'm going to say that.
That's great.
Yeah. Hey man, are you still working on watercolors? I was noticing on your Instagram over the past maybe year you were showing some interest. Is that a hobby?
I've I've stopped working with color for the time being. I'm just doing like a little bit of like some pencil stuff, and I have not been making the time for it that I'd like to, which is bad because when I go back to it, I've forgotten everything. But
it's nice. I like it. It's good stuff.
Yeah, well, I found that it was incredibly useful to me because it's one of the few things that's completely nonverbal, and cooking is pretty much that way. But I don't get to cook very much. I'm not at home for dinner. So, but when I'm in the kitchen, I can really be like, you just work at the stove and you turn up the heat, you turn down the heat, and you taste it. But it's not going through a logical side of your brain. It's, if you know what you're doing, and drawing is sort of the same way. It's a form of cerebral activity that's not really linked to language, and I found that I really needed that.
I wanted to go over a couple quick, I think I wrote quick NYC stuff in the notes, but the $1 slice or the $4 slice?
I mean, preferably the $4 slice would cost $1, but I think the quality of the $4 slice is gonna get my vote. I'm pretty excited about what's happening in slice land right now.
It's cool. Do we have good Mexican food here in New York, Pete Wells?
We do, just maybe not as much as we should, or not. I'd like for there to be more of it, but yes.
We hear that all the time, that there's no good Mexican food in New York, and it drives me crazy.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly don't want to get in a war with like any part of California over this, but
no.
But I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't even want to get in a war with Philadelphia over it, frankly, because I think that they've got a really cool Mexican scene going on right now.
I'd love to read your take on that. I think I agree fully. And also want to go back and plug Corsha Wilson wrote that story, so check it out. Google Corsha Wilson, New York Times. The best barbecue in New York, I feel this is not like the smoked, not Korean barbecue, but just like barbecue. I feel New York has great barbecue. Like, I feel like we're a city that has people who know what they're doing with wood and smoke and meat.
I think that is true, or was true. Barbecue is one of those things where if you haven't studied it for a while, you can fall out of touch pretty quickly. So it's actually been a couple of years since I went around and hit all the major contenders, like more than a few years. I mean, I think like Hometown's the one I've been back to most recently, and I think probably the most impressive, at least for brisket. But there's some others I need to go back to, and then there are a lot that people talk about that I think are not even worth mentioning.
I know. You give me that look like, Matt, you don't know what I'm talking about. And I think I haven't really made the run in a few years too. And that's really articulate and smart, because I don't like keep tabs of these things. Like I don't know that I did a story about it like 5 years ago, and it's in my head like, wow, I was surprised. But this must get at you a little bit when like the fast moving scene, like things change quickly, right? Your opinion actually will change because obviously the quality of the cooking increases or decreases.
Yeah, I mean that the brisket doesn't smoke itself. It's like there's somebody there, and if that person leaves or gets bored or doesn't, or like wants to earn more money, then I mean there are all sorts of reasons why a barbecue restaurant can, especially in New York, can be really good when they first open and they're trying to get themselves on the map. And then after 2 years, somebody wakes up and is like, oh, do I really have to put the brisket in at 4 a.m? Like really, maybe I'll just turn the heat up a little bit higher and
sleep till 5.
Yeah, right. And honestly, like, where if in Texas, if somebody tried to do that, they'd have customers yelling at them that morning. In New York, I'm not sure the customers are aware enough to push back.
I agree. Last one, the last meal you truly enjoyed off the clock, the restaurant meal, that is.
Oh, yeah, I got to cook last night, so that was
Oh, let's
fun.
talk about that. Yeah,
I made an Indian chicken that was really, really simple. Just some clove and cardamom and chili peppers and then of course ginger, garlic, onion. Really simple. And
tell me, do you have a book in you that you really want to do?
Nothing that I really want to do, but I'd like to find one that I really want to do. I can think of ones that I don't want to do.
You're gonna do a memoir like Born Around?
That's what I don't want to do.
Yeah, I was assuming that.
I don't really want to write my food history. It's just not that interesting, even to me.
I'm sure there's some interest.
But there must be something better I could do.
I wanted to ask you, so with all the interviews we run on our on the Taste podcast, we commission a really fun illustration. Shout out to Paige Vickers, who's our Vikers, it might be either way, our illustrator. But obviously we can't with you. You're anonymous, which I respect. So tell me, who should be your stand-in for the illustration that we commissioned for the Pete Wells Taste podcast interview?
Oh, you could have...
Could be anyone.
I've started to really identify with my Muppet avatar on Twitter, although now I'm not sure if he's Waldorf or Astoria. But I love the way he just puts this grouchy spin on whatever I say, even if it's not grouchy. You read it next to his little face, and it sounds like I'm waving my cane and get off.
We might be sued if we replicate a Muppet. So let's pick somebody.
I'm amazed that no one said anything to me about it. Yeah. So it should be a
non-trademarkable person.
Well, I don't know. Why can't it just be some better looking version of me? Just make me like so insanely attractive that I'm unrecognizable. Can't you do that?
You're a handsome guy. I will attest to that. So I won't take that answer. I can't. I don't want to. I want to.
Can I be an animal?
Yeah, you could be an animal. Let's start.
I mean, yeah. Fascinated by anteaters. That like sort of that. The idea of like they stick their tongues into places where they can't see, which is like a weird metaphor for a lot of things, I guess. But it's such a frightening but maybe inspiring way to get your dinner,
Anteater it is. P. Wells, thank you for joining the Taste Podcast.
Thank you.
Here's Anna speaking with Charlene Johnson-Hadley.
Welcome to the Taste Podcast, Charlene.
Thank you very much.
You are
Thanks
the
for having me.
executive chef at Brownsville Community Culinary Center. Really cool organization that I've heard so much about. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. Well, we're located in Brownsville, Brooklyn, and we are a facility that is there to serve the public. And with us serving the public, we look for local residents who have interest in culinary arts, and we pretty much bring them in. We vet participants who are interested in learning about culinary arts and furthering their education. And just about every 10 weeks, we take on a group of approximately 10 people and train them.
And it's paid, right? Like a paid apprenticeship?
Yes, they're paid. So the program is a 40-week program, but the last 10 weeks are outside of BCCC.
Cool. Kind of like a traditional externship program.
Yes.
Why Brownsville? Why did the co-founders choose that neighborhood in Brooklyn in particular?
The co-founders were looking for a place that had like a grassroots organization sort of background, and because they felt like whatever was done needed to have people who are very much community oriented, and it's not just about those who are opening and or running the space, but the people who are very interested in having the community involved as well. And so the co-founders are Klaus Meyer, the co-founder of NOMA, and Lucas Denton, who is a social justice activist, and they met by chance in a bakery. And they just started talking. Right, perfect place to meet. And they just started talking, and Lucas has previous history to working in Brownsville, and with him having his social justice background, he's worked in very many places in Brooklyn, and I believe that Klaus was interested in opening a location in Brooklyn, and that was Brownsville was the area that he thought was ripe and ready. Because when you look around Brooklyn, there are all the spaces have been discovered and rediscovered, but who's coming to Brownsville? No one really, and so they needed opportunity, and so they wanted to provide that opportunity in that neighborhood very specifically.
And you're from Brooklyn, right?
Yes.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in East Flatbush, Brooklyn.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
So as someone with a chef background and formal training, you went to the French Culinary Institute? Is that
Yes,
right?
I did.
Cool. How different is the training that participants get from BCCC from that really traditional culinary school training?
Well, I can say, if I compare it to my education that I received, that this is a lot more hands-on, a lot. And it's definitely a lot more involved, because in culinary school, when I was there, it's like you come in, you get to work. That was pretty much it. But we have a lot of participants who, beyond their education, they need assistance. And we get down, to the root of what their problems are. If they get anxious when they're in a certain area, well, why are you anxious? What can we do to help you? How can we facilitate your education? And
traditional restaurants and culinary schools don't do that.
I can't recall any of my chefs asking, well, Charlene, how are you? I can't necessarily say that they didn't care, but I was never asked. And, we definitely, where we see a need, we get involved in that need. And of course, it's not forceful at all. If we see a need, we offer assistance. And if we're told, I'm good, okay, so we leave it alone. But if you need something, we don't want you to feel. We understand that your needs directly reflect on how you take in this education you're being given. And if there's something that you're in need of, we try to support you, really. And yeah, and then also the groups are small, and so the chefs are literally always right there. So, I might be dealing with 8 people at a time, where in culinary school I had more people. It wasn't a lot more people, but, I am right there. All the chefs are literally right there.
What about in terms of the things that the participants are actually cooking on a day-to-day basis? Are there things that they are learning how to cook that you never experienced when you were in culinary school, or vice versa?
No, I mean, the menus obviously are different, because in culinary school, at a certain level, we started to cook for the public. And that's what most of their training, that's where they get their training, when they're actually doing for the public. And the menus are different, definitely. The menus that we had at FCI were a lot more French and a lot more classic. But at the end of the day, for me, food has nothing to do with what you're cooking. It's techniques. In order to cook, you have to understand technique. So the techniques are there. So there's a focus on techniques.
So at BCCC, there's obviously this educational component, but then there's also this public-facing cafe and bakery, right, that the participants in the apprenticeship are actually cooking and baking for. How do you go about designing that menu? Did you participate in that? Do the students participate? How did the menu come together? Because it seems to be everything from a good, healthy breakfast sandwiches, oatmeal, to black-eyed pea falafel and green curry soup. So how did that come together? What was the vision behind it?
Well, previous to us opening to the public, we as in the chefs, we would sit and have weekly meetings, and we thought about who were living in the neighborhood and people who might possibly come to the restaurant, and what sort of foods they would be interested in, or what could be easily presented to them without people feeling as if this is too strange for them to eat. Or so we sat down, we talked, and we worked on menus. We would come up with concepts, and we would prep it out and make it and present it. We would sit down, and our whole staff would sit and eat and think, say what did we like, what we didn't like, and just sitting and talking. And so we opened with the menu, and saw what worked and in real life. And since then, we've taken some things away and added some items.
Were there any, kind of big flops? Were there any things that people just didn't really order, that they were kind of confounded by?
No, not confounded, but things that couldn't come out in a realistic amount of time. Things that if we could do in advance would work very well. But in reality, in the pace in which you need to move in a cafe, which is pretty quick, you expect to get your food within, 8 to 15 minutes, let's say. Things weren't timed well. So there were some things taken away because of that purpose, but not because people didn't like it. This particular item that I'm thinking of is called the patty pies, which we had in our cafe, and we would we would present it to lots of different groups. So when we would work in fairs and things of that nature. They were always loved, but it's in the reality of service and doing multiple things at a time, it became too difficult because it's all handmade. We're making a dough from scratch. We're making the filling from scratch. We're hand patting them. It was a lot, but they were delicious.
You have a pastry background, right? You were a pastry chef at Red Rooster?
Yes, I do have a pastry background.
Do you work on the baking part at BCCC as well?
Well, I don't necessarily work on it per se, but I am very close to the baker there, Chef Susan Frankson, and we collaborate. So I'll say to her, Chef, I want a bread and I want it to be rich and I want it to be this size and it should be this many grams and we should put this on it. And she'll say, okay, so how about I do this and I'll add this to it, and be like, great. And she'll just go. And, she just knows what I want. I can literally have a conversation with her in less than 2 minutes and then she produces the next day. So it's great.
That's really cool. Have you guys worked on any new dishes recently or any new breads?
Well, coincidentally, we started a vegan burger yesterday. And so she did the bread that she did was, let's think of like a pretzel roll meets a brioche bun.
Ooh, but
yes.
It's vegan. How do you
actually, no, I'm not sorry. I did say vegan, but I should have said vegetarian because there is egg in the dough. And so, pardon me.
What is the patty like? How do you make a good...
Actually, that's the one item that we're not making, we're purchasing.
Oh, okay.
So we are, like I said, it was just started yesterday. So we're comparing and contrasting the burger patties right now. We're buying the burger patties, which strangely enough, when you look at our menu, we make absolutely positively everything from scratch. But we are testing 2 particular vegan-based patties. And everything else is that we're making. So, but it sold out yesterday. The customers were raving. One guy had 3, and these burgers are substantial in size. So it was hilarious to me. He ordered 2, and then he took 1 to go. And I was like, oh my God.
That's like the best compliment a chef can get.
Really is. It really is.
Something I always wonder, I always ask chefs about this, kind of like, how do you go about creating a neighborhood restaurant that really feels neighborhoody and that feels like it's kind of like has some of the personality of the neighborhood, but also isn't going to get overrun by tourists from, San Francisco or something.
Right. I think the first thing that you have to do, and I don't think it's about food at all, to be very honest. I think it has to do with hospitality. The first thing that you are going to encounter when entering a space is hospitality. That should be the first thing. How you're greeted, how you feel, the music that's playing, how familiar. Like you can walk into a space and you've never been there before, but it feels familiar or cozy, or you know what I mean? And so you have to be very deliberate in all those things. And then, after people feel comfortable and they pick up a menu and they see things that either intrigue them or that are familiar, and definitely the combination of those things, the things that are familiar, things that intrigue them, and things that just simply look delicious. So, though when you have those things, that combination. And you can, when you are talking about our space, our kitchen is open, which is very popular now. I started in the time where kitchens, there was a very deliberate back of the house and a very, specific front of the house. But like our space is very open, and the openness feels welcoming. And, most people who come through the door know that the majority of the people walking around are participants who are in the learning, and so they understand that, and they're taught to be this is your space. Treat people like when you're bringing someone into your home.
Yeah, it pays off.
Yeah.
Why do you think that has become so popular, having the open kitchen and being able to see?
Because I think it has to do with people just being curious. You know, food is a billion-dollar industry, and the reason why there's so many food shows and there's a whole network dedicated to food is because of the interest. And so, like, when people can see what's happening, it's interesting. You want to see the intensity on the people's face when they're putting things together, when they're cooking. You want to be able to, and the fact that it's not hidden also allows you to feel like it raises standards. There was a time where people would say, like, there would be a chef in the back and he's sweating into a pot. Well, that's not happening when a kitchen is open. You know what I mean?
And you're not like you can't like secretly defrost like frozen dinner rolls,
right? And present them as if they're house-made.
Yeah,
and
people know.
Yeah, there's no secrets. There's nothing to hide. And when you come into a space where there's nothing to hide, people. That also adds to that comfortable feeling that we're looking.
And the people cooking the food get to see when someone orders a third veggie burger,
right?
Which is pretty cool.
And when they are happy with it, or like they can be. They're there for a compliment. There's a difference between like a waiter bringing you a compliment and a person telling you a compliment directly. So, and they can feel proud about what it is that they're doing. So,
yeah. You mentioned that most of the things served are made totally from scratch. Is there an emphasis on local ingredients or things that you could find easily in Brooklyn, or are there ingredients that you wish were included in the menu that are just like too hard to get?
No, we try to be seasonal. We do, and we try our best to be seasonal. So we consider what's like availability. Ingredients, of course, we try to be fresh and so on and so forth. But a lot of the ingredients, I think the participants come in knowing, but they may not have handled, or they may not have seen in its original state, right? So maybe ginger root is something you've walked past in the supermarket a million times, but you've never handled it and you don't know how to do it. But you're familiar with the taste and you're familiar with, but now it's time for you to get familiar with how to use it and so on and so forth. So, we have we're dealing with things where we have a emphasis on healthy. We have an emphasis on seasoning with the purpose of flavoring, but not over salting. Like there's people are gung ho with salts. As a chef, I always notice when a person receives food and shakes salt on it before they even tasted it.
Yeah.
And that makes me nuts. But it's also, we are located in Brownsville and they have a very high diabetic rate and a very high blood pressure and a lot of diseases that if you controlled the food that you ate, we are trying to expose them to nutrition that they may not have every day in their homes, and understanding why just enough salt or lightly salting, or why, you want to consider that you're making a sandwich. Well, there's salt in the bread, there's salt on the meat that you're doing. Everything has, so you don't want to go heavy. And there's a reason you don't want to, and understanding how the balances of the spices that are in things contribute to the flavor. And it's not, the emphasis shouldn't all be on salt or sugar and things of that nature. We do have the juices that we produce. We are juicing fresh. We are doing all these things fresh, and they're lightly sweetened, but we do have simple syrups. If there are people who they desire more sugar, but we want to be the alternative. We don't sell sodas, and if there is something like a soda, it's because we're making it, so we're adding seltzer. We really want to be an alternative to the fast foods, because in the neighborhood, all that can be eaten is pretty much predominantly fast foods. Brownsville hasn't had a sit-down restaurant in about 50 years. So this is all new to the residents. I mean, they can obviously go outside if they want to, if they're celebrating and they want to go to a restaurant and things like that. But to have one across the street from you or down the block and around the corner, and having a space. So we want to just provide people with a different experience.
I guess just in December, right, you had Carla Hall come in and cook for a little pop-up benefit. Are you working on any other collaborations or any events coming up?
With the Carla Hall events, that is something that we do about every 3 to 4 months. We would have a guest chef come in, and they would come in and speak to the participants about their food story, how they got involved in the food industry, whatever it is that is, on their particular radar, exposing the participants to it, because we want them to understand, it's more than just being a chef or just being like maybe a maitre d' or a waiter or something like that. There are very many things that you can do from this industry. And we would have them come in, we would speak, and then we've had events where we've just brought the public in and have them have an opportunity to sit down and have these same conversations with these particular chefs. We don't have anything on the schedule right now, but we are having a fundraiser in March because we're a not-for-profit at the end of the day, and we do need to keep the lights on. And we were having a fundraiser, and all the money that's donated goes right back into BCCC, getting aprons and
And tickets are available to the public?
Yes.
Can anyone come?
Of course, definitely.
Cool. Yeah.
We're not turning anyone
What
away.
will the food be like?
The food is going to be like African diaspora. Essentially, all of our food is. Chef JJ will be donating his time.
That's JJ Johnson.
JJ Johnson, yes, from the Henry. We have had a few of our participants go and work there. We have one working there right now, I believe, and she's doing well.
Cool. Well, Charlene, thank you so much for coming and talking to me.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
The Taste Podcast is hosted by Matt Rodbard and me, Anna Heasel. The show is produced by Gabrielle Lewis, studio recordings by Pat Stango, theme music by Steve Rydell. Interviews are recorded live at Books Are Magic in Cobble Hill, Brooklyn, and at Penguin Random House Studios in Manhattan. Visit Taste online at tastecooking.com. Thanks for listening.